Beginning with this class, there's going to be a lot of artists that I've interviewed. And so what I'm planning to do is spend a lot more time on those artists because their words, I think, are really valuable, and I think will give you insight into how they think and how they approach their art. And I have exact quotes, and I think that it's really valuable and will probably be more interesting to you because everything, all the shorter things that I'm doing when I haven't interviewed them is, you know, research, and it's in the book. So, but because I'm going to spend more time, for example, in this class we'll be doing, 3 of the artists that I interviewed are Chaim Gross, Leo Manso, and Robert Motherwell. And for example, Robert Motherwell was brilliant. I interviewed him twice. He died in 1991. And I interviewed him once in Provincetown and once in Greenwich, Connecticut, where he lived, a good part of it. He's half the year. And he was brilliant, and he really was the spokesman for the abstract expressionists. So what he says has about art will really, I think, resonate with us. And that's the only time I'm going to be reading. I don't read, but I will be reading their quotes so you get an exact, you know, as I heard them. All of these interviews were taped. So I have the exact words, and I just thought that would be more interesting. So, but please, if you know, we're going to start with Thomas Eastwood, who is a really interesting artist, and he was a real discovery for me, and I even think for Dee Dee. There's a number of pieces of his in the collection. I could find almost nothing about him. If you see the little section in the book, you could see it's probably the smallest, because the research I did, he's not anywhere that I could find, but his art is really interesting. He was born in 1902, died in relatively young in 1957. And as you're going to see, he's done some really, he started out interested in the Ashcan school. That was the John Sloan, Robert Henride, George Bellows, who wanted to capture mostly the urban scene. And so he was Thomas Eastwood was influenced by the Ashcan school initially. But what we discovered was, and this, you know, that was obviously a city scene. This is the subway, but pretty modern in the way he approached it. And as you see, well, I'm going to get to this one. Certainly, Cubist. So here's, and obviously he died in '57. Things were you know, the abstract expressionists were pretty well, you know, dominating the scene. But here he was doing some pretty modern stuff. And this one, I was hanging in the library, and you'll see it upstairs. It was hanging in the library. And while Dee Dee and I were working on, you know, going through the collection and making some decisions, and I looked at that, I said, that's so modern, who did that? And it was Thomas Eastwood, which is so interesting. It's, what is it called? War memorabilia, I think. It's, yeah, war memorabilia. Certainly Cubist. So interesting. Anyway. He was a true discovery. He also did the little drawings for the New Yorker. And there's a large collection of them here at the museum, and here are some of the ones.
That one's sideways, or was it meant to be that way?
Yeah.
It's a... Yes, you're right. It's wrong. You're right.
Okay.
It is sideways. It should be turned around. Is it right in the book? I wonder.
Yes. Yes, it's right in the book.
Okay, good.
I thought he was making a statement.
It looks like.
I thought that was a joke for the New Yorker.
No. You know what it looks like, but it isn't. And there's another one. And another one. And you can see even there, the image is, you know, very typically of what the New Yorker did.
Are these pen and ink?
I'm sorry?
Those are pen and ink?
Yeah. Well, he would have done them and they would have been reproduced. Yeah, I'm not sure what the originals are. They would be in the book.
I
Okay.
think it's pen and ink.
Let's
They
see.
do look like it.
What they would be in. Yeah, they're ink, pen and ink. They're all original. It is right in the book. Okay, this is William Freed. He was married to, and you'll see her in a few minutes, Lillian Orlowski. They both studied with Hoffman. He had started out in, you know, more abstract expressionism. Obviously he started, a lot of these artists started out as representational painters, and then they moved on. Now he became an abstract expressionist, and then he got involved in a more geometric approach to art, certainly abstract. This is a little looser, but his art was certainly abstract. There's some early pieces that are at Pam that are kind of abstracted still lifes that are beautiful. They're really quite nice. Here was another really interesting artist, William Littlefield, who he studied in Europe, and he settled in Falmouth. And this is kind of a street in Woods Hole. Very interesting. He was first influenced by the Barbizon painters, Corot and Courbet, and he also studied with Hoffman, and obviously went from what we just saw to abstract work. Some beautiful pieces. When we go upstairs, there's some really nice pieces. This is one of my favorites. I love this piece. There's so much movement. And the way he's kind of created these forms and shapes, and yet all of that movement. And when we go upstairs, we can look at it in real time, because it's really a beautiful painting.
Did you say he studied in Europe?
I'm sorry.
Did
Yes.
you say he studied?
Yeah.
Oh, because that looks a lot like a Kandinsky to me. I wonder if he had any
Yeah.
influence from him.
You're going to have to.
Yeah, I
I'm
was just
sorry.
wondering if there was an influence from Kandinsky maybe when he was in Europe, but the
Oh.
dates may not add up because Kandinsky was much sooner, but
Yes,
maybe he was
but you know,
saw his work.
when they were in Europe, they
Yeah.
saw all this stuff, even if they didn't get to know the artist,
right.
they saw all
It was
this.
there. In the,
Yeah, so that,
Yeah,
that it
yeah,
would
it
have been,
might be.
yes. Yeah, there is, I could see where you would say that. Particularly
the last one.
this
Yeah.
one.
Uh-huh.
That one,
Hmm.
more so than that one, I think.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think this
The other
just
one,
had.
yeah. So then, this is interesting, we're gonna go into Horace Margot. And these were, I'm sorry, these were still,
Littlefield.
let me go back. These are still Littlefield. He's an artist that, you know, has not gotten a lot of attention, and yet, I find him so interesting. He, however, is in the collections. Okay, he's in the Museum of Modern Art, the Worcester Art Museum, and the MFA, and at University Museums at Harvard, Smith, and Vassar. So, but not, for example, when I remember loving that one painting, the one that reminded you of Kandinsky, seeing it here, because it was hanging downstairs for a long time, and thinking what a wonderful artist he was, and why didn't he get more attention? And we're going to explore that a little bit later on today when we talk we talk about Motherwell, because he had a lot to say about the marketplace and all of that, which will be pretty interesting. This is Boris Margot, and during the Depression, when he couldn't really afford art materials, he created his own plates to do prints, and these are called cello cuts. And he actually poured melted plastic and acetate, put it on a surface, let it dry, and then he cut into it just as if he was doing an etching or an aquatint. It was a plate. So these are all cello cuts that are in the museum collection.
So, Deborah?
Yes.
So when he did, he melted. Can you say that again? He melted.
What he did was he melted plastic and acetate, poured it onto a surface. After the plastic hardened, he had a plate. It would be like, now you can buy these plastic plates and cut into them and print, but he did it himself.
And then, but the color isn't in the plastic. The color you put on late, just like you do other kinds of things.
He would be cutting into it, and it would be both surface and intaglio. Yeah.
Thank you.
Here's another one. So yeah, see the orange would have been a surface cut, but then he was cutting into it. The inking process would have been pretty interesting. He probably was doing it several times, and my guess is he had several plates that he was then registering. So one plate, in the way it's normally done, one plate would be a color, and then another plate, and then when you were printing it, you had to register it so that they came out even. I really like this one. The way, I think it's called Dancers. It's so, Dancers. See, now this is an edition of 50, and this is the 34th pull from the plate that he did. So he could do large editions with these cello cuts. And this is a really, look at the move. It's abstract, but it's called Dancers. And you can almost see them. So obviously there's a surface print and a intaglio print. The lines, I think, were cut in.
Deborah?
Yeah.
When you look at these things, do you recognize the author, the painter, right away from, or
Well,
the
for
style?
some of them I do. I didn't know Boris Margot at all. I mean, I was not familiar with his work. But if it's an artist that I know, I always give myself a pat on the back when I can go into a museum and say, oh, that's a Peter Busso, or that's a Robert Motherwell, or something like that, because, I became familiar with them. But I'm not sure I would have known that was a Boris Margot. No. So, yeah, some I would, some. And now, of course, I've looked at them, and so I have a better idea. So here we're going from, Boris Margot was born in 1902, and John Wharf was born a year later. And look at the difference of the work. Margot died in 95, John Wharf died in 1959. So here are two artists, basically contemporaries, And John Wharf, who had a very long connection in Provincetown. He studied with George Elmer Brown and some of the early years, and Richard Miller, Max Bohm, and Hawthorne. And he's mostly known for his watercolors. And they're beautiful, but very certainly impressionistic. He did a lot of he did still lifes. He did a lot of obviously seascapes, but very traditional. Think of that. Think of what we just saw, Boris Margot, and then we're going to look and see about Howard Gibbs. They're lovely, but the contrast is interesting. Howard Gibbs, so it's kind of going from the sublime to the, I don't want to say ridiculous. Howard Gibbs was a very influenced by Fauvis color, which was Matisse and some of his followers, and that idea was that color didn't have to be natural. It could be determined by the composition and the shape and the aesthetics of the composition, and not necessarily, grass didn't have to be green, or a face could be, didn't have to be skin color, it could be anything. And here, certainly Howard Gibbs was very influenced by the Fauves. He studied in Boston, and as we know, and even to this day, Boston their tastes were very conservative. They almost stopped collecting with Impressionists. And if you go there, their contemporary or post-World War II collection is really pathetic, I would say. I compare it to, I don't want to compare it to the New York museums, that's a whole other story, but I can compare it to to Philadelphia. And the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where I grew up in Philadelphia and went there often, and their collection is so much more important in terms of post-World War II art. So Howard Gibbs kind of left Boston because he felt stifled by Boston tastes. And he came to Harwich and eventually moved to Brewster. Actually, they're a group of artists called the Stony Brook Artists, which is on the street where I live. And I didn't know any of them, but it included Betty Lane, who we're going to see, Vernon Smith, who you saw before, Harry Hall, Arno Geisbuehler, included some writers, Conrad Aiken and John Hay. And it was a nice, tight little group of artists and writers. And I know Dee Dee is interested in trying to put a show together of some of that, of some of their work. And we will see some of the artists who were part of that group as we move along. And certainly Howard Gibbs was, I saw that upstairs. When we go up, we'll see it. It's a really nice still life. But look at the colors, how strong they are. And again, when we talk about 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, that ends up being pretty flat. That table, the fruit in the vase would be falling off of it. So it's not realistic in that sense. This is also upstairs. I think we looked at that last week. Is that called the Boston Crowd or something? I think that's what it's called. And this is a really nice piece. Just kind of talk about movement on something still. And that's him too. So that's an early one. I wish it was in the other way. But anyway, gives you a sense of his range. Chaim Gross, So he's one of the artists that I interviewed, and I first met him interviewed him in 1984. He in Provincetown, and he was born in he was 80 years old at the time, and I think, let me just go. There's a picture of him. Now, that's a much younger man, and that's a bronze. And when I got to know him, he had this mane of gray hair, and he was this he carved wood. He was a sculptor, and the pieces that are in the book and in the collection are not his sculpture, which is why I've added some of these pieces so you could see what he did. He grew up in Galicia, which I guess was in Austria at the time, born in 1904. His father had a lumber business, and so he got to know the men in the business, and some of them were wood carvers. And ultimately, Chaim became a wood carver. He loved to carve wood. So when I met him, he was 80 years old, and he in Provincetown, in a house where he bought a house that George Elmer Brown had lived in on Franklin Street, which is away from the water, kind of up a hill. And he was a really lovely man, and I want to get to some of the quotes. He died in 1991, and he had a memorial service at the Provincetown Museum, and I'm going to read you some of what some of his fellow artists said about him. But my experience with him was, I kind of got to know him pretty well. I didn't always with the artists that I interviewed. Most of the time I didn't. But he was just a very generous, open, really lovely man. He had, when he wasn't in Provincetown, he had a 3-story house in Greenwich Village, and on the bottom floor was his studio, and the upper 2 floors were where he lived with his wife. When we were in New York, we used to go visit him, and they were always very, very hospitable. His wife Renee would come out with fruit and coffee and cookies, and we would sit and chat. And he had a very large collection of African carvings very large collection, and he would and art from many of his artist friends, and he would give us a tour of the house and the art. And anyway, he was just very very generous and very hospitable. But he was telling me that from the time he came to this country, he came to this country in 1921 with a brother. Everybody else in his family stayed in Europe and were lost or died during the Holocaust. So he was very lucky to have come here. He studied in New York, but he said he was intent on becoming an artist and a sculptor specifically. And he said he just was he was happy to be what he called a delivery boy. He said, I didn't want to be a clerk. I didn't want to get a steady job. He said if he actually advanced to being a clerk, it meant buying into the conventional life and getting married and raising children and having to make a living, and he didn't want to do any of that, although he eventually did get married and had 2 children. And he said he said, I was very stubborn. I made up my mind to be a sculptor, and I didn't want to do anything else. And he said he found jobs, and he could live in the 20s, he said, in $4 and $5 a week. He said you could do that then. So anyway, the latter part of the decade, he worked for the WPA in the 30s, and he told me a story about, he was in Provincetown, and then he had to go back to New York for work so he could collect his $23.75 from the government because of his WPA work. But he was very fortunate. In 1935, the Museum of Modern Art bought a piece, and then a few years later, so did the Met. So in the 30s, he was already becoming, you know, reaching some sort of importance. He did, from the 50s through the 70s, he got a lot of commissions. And that ended up him doing a lot of bronzes. And he had to kind of set aside the wood carving that he loved. He just loved carving wood. So he did a sculpture of birds of freedom for Hebrew University in Israel. And he also did a large relief of the Ten Commandments, which are at the International Synagogue at Kennedy Airport in New York. And when we're in Provincetown, in front of the library, there are this bronze piece called Tourists. And it's this, has everybody seen it? Okay, that's Chaim Gross. And you know, you have this kind of short man, and you have the tall woman, and rather buxom, and and that was kind of typical of the kinds of things that Chaim would do. He was very he always he talked with an Eastern European and a Yiddish accent, kind of mixed. And he talked about, he used this word, his log of wood. He talked reverentially about that log of wood. And that's, he worked with hardwood. The female figure was a very significant part of his work. I think we have another, yes. Okay, good. When he was working in wood, he's working on a log of wood. When we used to go visit him, we would go down to the studio, and there were all these big logs of wood. But, you know, a log of wood is vertical. So he was limited on what he could do. He could do one figure, and if he had to do two figures, he had to do them one on top of the other, like this one. And a lot of them were, when you look at that, let's talk about that. When you look at that, how does that make you feel?
Happy.
Happy. It's very joyful. And he did a lot of acrobats, and the mother and child was a very significant theme of his work. He these are the pieces in his in the collection here, and there's some acrobats. So he also drew, but he really did focus on the human form. So when we were talking about how he approaches his sculpture, he said, and let's look again at some of that, because I think it's interesting. There's this kind of sense of serendipitous, kind of light and like, although carving wood you can't really say, it's not like painting, but there's that sense of spontaneity and buoyancy from this hard piece of material, which is kind of interesting. And so I asked him at that time, I said, you know, how do you know, a lot of artists tell me that, particularly painters, they'll say, I don't really have an idea when I start to paint, and I'll just put a mark on the canvas and one thing leads to another. Other artists say they really plan it. They do studies. But so I asked Chaim about that, and he said, I don't depend on miracles. I know before I start working on a log of wood or stone, well, maybe not exactly, what I'm going to do. I visualize in 3 dimensions. I don't depend on accidental things. And when you're carving wood, I guess an accident could be lethal. So again, he focused on the human form, on acrobats and jugglers, and you can see that translated in these pieces. This is a and this obviously is the Torah related to his Jewish traditions. for 20 years, because he was fortunate enough to have all these commissions and he worked in bronze, he really couldn't, he didn't have time to carve wood, which is probably a very long, painstaking thing. But when I interviewed him, he was finally getting back to wood carving, and he said, but he didn't, it was like, I guess, riding a bicycle. He didn't forget. He said, you know, he just was happy to get back to that. And in his studio, of course, what he was doing was all this wood that I saw and that was in New York. He, when we think about his sculpture, and we'll look at some more, and we think about painting, we think about color. But color isn't really an important aspect of most sculpture. And he said the important thing in sculpture is shape, form, and movement. So when we look, and certainly you see movement here in some of his work, but when you see this one, you do feel like it's moving. Or do we? Mm-hmm. We do have a sense of movement. He said with bronzes, and as we saw here, when he was carving wood, he just had that log, but he could stretch out. When he did a bronze, he did a mold, and you know, so he was free of any of the limitations he had with a log of wood. And you can see how big that is.
Do you know if he was sculpting in clay when he did bronzes?
Yes.
Okay.
And, you know, making a mold, and then they would go to the foundry. Yeah, the typical way. And he was doing big commissions. And that took up a great deal of time. So he died in New York in 1991, as I said. He was 87. And several months later, about 150 people came to the Provincetown Art Association Museum for a memorial service, and I went to cover it for the paper. And here are some of the things that people said. Sidney Simon, who we're going to get to in a little bit, he was also a sculptor. He said, Chaim taught me how to live without having money. And he was referring to that he could trade art for supplies. And he said, there's no one who could carve like him. And he also talked about Chaim's generosity. He said, when I switched from painting to sculpture, he was the only sculptor who wasn't mad at me. And Sidney Simon also said that when he became a sculptor, Chaim introduced him to some of Chaim's patrons. So that's how generous he was. He was going to share the wealth, so to speak. Bogosian, who was another artist that is in the collection and we'll talk about, said that of Chaim, he said he fulfilled every possibility that his time could encompass. And he said that could not be said of every man. And a lot of people talked about his, the joyful part of his, there's a wonderful quote here when people ask him about why his work is so joyful. And he said, it has something to do, he said, with his Jewish Hasidic traditions, which emphasize the blissful worship of God. But then he paused for a moment and he said, ultimately, happiness comes from within. He was that kind of person where, you know, he was very thoughtful and very open about sharing things with you, which is why I feel like I want to share it with you. Mervyn Jules, who was president of the Art Association at one point, and also an artist, said, he was the kind of human being you wished you could be yourself. So, he was an artist that you know, I really grew to love in a way, you know, in a grandfatherly way, I suppose, but he was just so warm, and his work is truly beautiful. And it's unfortunate that we don't have in a piece of sculpture by him in that little gallery as you go upstairs to the left. There's a wish list there, if everybody's looked at it. And you will see, certainly Chaim is on that list, a piece of sculpture by him. This is Elliot Orr. He's kind of a cross between 19th century Romanticism and Corot and Constable and Albert Pinkham Ryder, who was an important 19th century Romanticist. That's Mother and Child. His work was dark. This one's upstairs. I just looked at it. There's a kind of mood, certainly. And certainly the contrast between, say, this Mother and Child and one of Chaim's would be very different. Chaim's would be joyful. There's a sculpture outside the Provincetown Museum of a mother swinging a child. I should have tried to capture it here, but anyway, it's a really, when you pass by, you'll see it. It's a wonderful, you get a real sense of elation and joy, the joy of motherhood. But here, Elliot Orr gives you a whole different, I don't know, what do people feel about this?
Oh, it's dark, you know, it's depressing. It's as though there's
A little
mood.
postpartum depression going
Yeah.
on there.
Right. She doesn't look very happy. Okay, so now we go into Martha Cahoon, part of the Cahoon family, the wife of Ralph Cahoon. The museum doesn't have any works by Ralph. A very large, and everybody knows the Cahoon Museum of American Art in Katuitt, and they have a large collection. But I found out recently, I'm on the collections committee at the Heritage Museum, they have a larger collection of Ralph Cahoon than even the Cahoon Museum. They have dozens of them. However, we don't, this museum does not have any by Ralph. Have two by Martha. And these look very, if you talk about, would you identify the artist if I saw that piece, I would say that's Ralph Cahoon. Because he did the mermaids, and here's another one. He did those hot air balloons, but these are Martha's. So we have Ralph kind of represented, but not really. So if I saw that, I'd say, oh, that's a Ralph Cahoon, but it isn't, it's a Martha Cahoon. And she's kind of, you know, think about Chaim Gross and Horace Margot, what we've looked at, even Thomas Eastwood, and now we get into Martha Cahoon, and it's kind of a throwback to it. You know, she was born in Harwich. Her father decorated furniture, and when she and Ralph married, that's what they did at first. They decorated furniture with these folk art images derived from Pennsylvania Dutch and American folk traditions. And then eventually they got into the painting. And they bought the house in Katuitt, which of course is now the museum. And her work is mostly kind of not like this. It's more like nostalgic country scenes. But she obviously was influenced by her husband. This is Betty Lane. She's also part of the Stony Brook Circle. She studied in Washington, D.C. at the Corcoran School of Art, and then she was in Paris. And she was early influenced by Surrealism, but I don't think you'll see any of that in what we have. This self-portrait, this is Betty Lane self-portrait. It's subtitled Retired Liberation MPS. She was teaching at Miss Porter's school and retired, and that's when I think she came to Brewster to live. And actually, of that whole Stony Brook school, I got to know Betty Lane. She lived diagonally across the street from me, and when we moved in, she was the first person that came with, I don't know, cake or a welcoming gift. And so I got to know her, went to her house, I went to a few parties at her house, so I did get to know Betty. And I've met her son, who lives out in California. So this is Arnold Geisbuehler, and that's a beautiful portrait. Look at how much character she gives to the face with the color and the brushstroke. It's a really wonderful portrait. I assume it looks like him. I'm sure we have pictures of him. This is Gay Head. It's a landscape. And it reminds me a lot, it's pretty flat. It reminds me a little bit of Milton Avery. You know, kind of bright colors. Certainly, look at that red. That's probably not a natural color. She just, you know, that's kind of a strong element in the work. Okay, this is Kenneth Stubbs. So, who was he influenced by? Cubist, right? Clearly. He specifically Brock. And this is kind of a topsy-turvy arrangement of houses that kind of looks like Provincetown, doesn't it? And then there's this one. Oh. Is Still Life with Melon. And look how he's faceted those. These are very small. You're looking at a gigantic. When we go upstairs, you're going to see how small these paintings are. They're really small. They're like this big, I think, or something. They're really tiny. But you can see how he's faceted what the Cubists did. Mike Wright, who we'll see very later on, her sculptures upstairs, was influenced by Kenneth Stubbs. He died in 1967, I think before Mike was in Provincetown, but she knew his work. Unfortunately, the only piece we have by Phillip Mallicoat is this drawing, which really gives you a sense of his style of painting, and that's typical. We only have the drawing, we don't have a painting by Phillip Mallicoat. He was very entrenched in Provincetown. He has a son who still lives there, a granddaughter. As far as I know, she still lives there, and they both are artists. He did these very subtle landscapes, very loose, not strong colors. However, he's at some major museums. He's at the Hirshhorn and the Chrysler Museum in Norfolk. And when we have time, maybe at the end, we'll talk about who are some of our favorite artists that we've seen. We should come up with a list, maybe the last day. Okay, so we're going to go from here. We're going to go from here to Herman Barrow. And he was very influenced, I think, by Milton Avery. obviously connected to Provincetown. So we went from Phillip Mallicoat, okay. And this is Herman Barrow. Brighter, you can really see the light. Certainly you don't see it in Mallicoat. And Barrow was connected to Provincetown. And then you get to George McNeil. And Barrow, by the way, 1908 to 1986, he was in Provincetown. He was influenced by Avery and Kunitz and Rothko. And you can almost see the, oh, I did that again, okay. Let me go back. You know, we think of Rothko and those flat areas of color. You could see, although Barrow was a representational artist, you could see that, you know, and certainly Avery, I see a real strong connection to Avery, particularly in something like this. Which, I mean, it's an obvious landscape, but certainly abstract. So then we go to George McNeil, who started out as an abstract expressionist, and this is very typical of abstract expressionism, this gesture and this movement, and one of the things that it was important to see the hand of the artist. Some of it was pretty messy. Do we like this? Okay.
Yes.
Like a lot of abstract expressionists, they moved on, and so George McNeil went on to become what we call a figurative expressionist. So when we look at that, what do we, I mean, the colors are pretty bright and bold, and some people see kind of a playful quality, and other people see this kind of tension or angst. How do we feel about this? Who sees the playful aspect?
It's kind of a cross between something sinister and something playful.
Okay.
I mean, it's kind of like, you're not really sure.
That almost looks like a gas mask.
Yes,
doesn't
yeah.
it? What is it called? It's called No Uncertain Terms. But a lot of abstract expressionists moved into what they call this figurative expressionism, where they kept a connection to something in the real world, and McNeil was one of them. This is Lawrence Kufferman, who along with Howard Gibbs, who decided that Boston was just too staid for him, and he left Boston, and because he was an abstractionist, and came to he found Provincetown just really freeing him to not be shackled by the conservatism of Boston. He found Provincetown's climate and the whole aura of it as an artist colony exhilarating. This is called Nauset Light. So maybe that's the light that's coming out of the, it's hard to tell, but he was certainly into abstract art. And this one is driftwood and beach. And certainly you can see the driftwood. This is George Gator, obviously influenced by Impressionism. He had a long connection with the Cape. He lived He had a house in Truro and very much connected to the art colony. This is very, you know, kind of light, impressionistic. What he also did, though, were works like, this is the Penniman House in East Ham, which is very different. It's much more controlled, much more defined. But also what he did was photographs of the artist community. That's Ross Moffat. See if I can name them all. Now that has Hans Hoffman. And they're wonderful photographs. And this is Bud Hopkins. John Wharf, the sea guy.
Yeah.
See how he got that, he really captured them. Henry Henshey. He even looks angry there, doesn't he?
He does.
Okay, we're gonna Will Burnett. He lived to be 101 years old. I interviewed him when he was 100 by telephone. He was having a show at the Provincetown Art Association Museum, and I called him. He was in New York. It was 2011. He died in 2012. He was as bright and as alive and as knowledgeable and as coherent, and he was a funny guy. And as we were talking, we talked for a long time. Sometimes most of the interviews I've done are person to person, but I had to get this done quickly, and he was not coming to the Cape. He was 100 years old. He was not going to come to the Cape for the exhibition, so I quickly did a phone interview. But I think we talked for 45 minutes on the phone, and at the end he said, "So, do you ever come to New York?" And I said, "Oh yeah." He says, "Well, you're going to have to stop by for a drink." He said, "But after 5 o'clock, because I work until then." So I never did, but anyway, I loved it when he said that. He is mostly known for his figurative work. And we'll just look at them real quickly. Love cats. Women. He has the women. But when we look at this work, what do we see? We see, first of all, it's flat, two-dimensional. When we think of Betty Lane's Portrait of Geisbuehler, we get a real sense of who this man was. These could be anyone. And what he is doing, so we were talking about, let me just show you, this is some of his abstract work. But Will Burnett is mostly known for his representational work. So I asked him about that, and he said he felt there was a crossover between the two. And he said, I've never drawn a figure realistically. As far as he was concerned, they were shapes. Shapes in the form of people, but they were shapes. And he said they may look realistic, but there's a formal quality to them, and that's the structure. He said, my abstract work is always figurative. So he felt there was a crossover. So when we think about this, and he was a big one for talking about and trying to emphasize that there was no difference between negative and positive space. Okay, so the positive space here are the figures and the mantle. But when we look at what we would normally say the background or the negative space, he was very much interested in the play between that the negative space, the shape of the negative space was as important as the positive space. So that was about the abstract elements that he was interlacing in the figurative work. It's flat. Now, the cat dominates, but look at that kind of tile floor. That's kind of the background, but it isn't negative space. And even the white there is, you know, there's a shape to that white. And he was very interested in playing, in promoting negative space as being as important as positive space. He spent many summers in Provincetown in the 50s and 60s when he was a lot younger. And he studied at the Museum School of, in Boston. But he denied that he was ever an academic painter. He said, I was always a little on the modern side. He admired Paul Cézanne. In the 30s, he studied at the Art Students League, and then he became the league printer in 1935. And the pieces we have here are all serigraphs or silkscreen prints. He was, his prints are all over, and he was a expert printmaker. But he did, you know, as I say, and as he likes to indicate, he was certainly interested in abstraction. And maybe when we deal with negative and positive space, you see it maybe more clearly here. Is there any negative space in this piece? I mean, the color kind of gives you some sense of volume. So the black or the red pop up, right? The yellow, the gray kind of stays behind just by the nature of the visual thing. But look at the shape of the gray. The gray becomes as important. And I think you can see that clearer in his abstract work. But he was trying to do that in his figurative work as well. I'm trying to think, he said while teaching, he said it was important to restrain self-expression. His work is, and we're going to get to Motherwell shortly, and some of the figurative expressionists who were very emotional. These works are, when we look at them, they're cool, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
He was tapping into kind of, even with, when we look at, there you see, he has some angst here, that's a little,
Even in the eyes of the cat, you get something,
where
in
the
this particular one,
hat,
the eyes.
oh, the eyes, yes. But flat, look how flat it is. There's no, and he was trying to, by doing this, by doing these women the way they are, he was trying to tap into a universality. They weren't any woman. They weren't a particular woman. They weren't any woman. And they were not more than just women. They were shapes.
They don't seem related, any of these, the figures or the animals, have occupy their own space.
Yes.
And they're not related.
Yes,
to one
right.
another.
Yeah, exactly right. Yes, even, right, the bird, the cat's looking at the bird, but, and he had certain things that he was, you know, she looks pretty concerned about.
Like she'd seen an Alfred Hitchcock.
Right. Yeah, right.
You had that guy looking at you, and I think.
But I don't think that's really typical of his, okay. Nano de Groot. So he was, again, part of the New York School, an abstract expressionist, and moved on to figurative expressionism. Do we like that?
Yeah, I guess.
Certainly interesting. Here's a couple of other pieces by him. I think, what is that called? It's called, that was Ladies by the River. This is two figures. And this is Winter Pastoral.
It's nice.
Kind of different, isn't it? From even that. This is so busy and kind of chaotic, and then you get to even that. Then you get to this kind of quiet. So what's so interesting is these artists just really have so much diversity. If they've had a long life, they've done a lot of things. And a lot of art, as one artist said, oh, we'll get to him, Sidney Simon, who said, you know, if the wind blows one way, I go another. You know, I'm not gonna conform. I'm gonna do my own thing. And we're gonna get to Motherwell. I really want to try to do that. Okay, we're in pretty good. Oh, I'm doing good, aren't I? Okay, so Peter Busa also he studied with Hoffman. He started out as an abstract expressionist and was part of that movement. But he also worked figuratively and abstract, and here's some pieces. A lot of it was geometric. He also got involved in this group called, they worked with Native American themes, and they were called Indian Space. He did several other, actually so did Will Barnett, get involved in this kind of geometric, and they were using elements from Native American art. And this is one of the pieces that he did.
It kind of looks like a sand painting, in a way.
A what?
An Indian sand painting. I'm not sure what tribes did it, but
Yes.
it's, you know, it's reminiscent of that.
Yeah,
Not so much in the color.
Again. Yeah, there's even a face.
Uh-huh.
So you can see the kind of variety if I look at this one. I'm not differentiating. Okay, let's go back. These two are not in the collection. These two are.
Yes.
These two are, those two are, but the other two are not. That certainly
Yeah.
looks like has that kind of Native American feel to it. Very, this is, when we go upstairs, it's kind of interesting. We're going to go actually into we've been mostly in that one room where they more traditional. We're actually going to get into that other room with a more modern art. And this is Leo Mantha. And this is the only piece we have of his in the collection, and it's an early piece. But he was moved into kind of spiritual, but very influenced in Eastern philosophy. I interviewed him, and he's the father of Peter Mantha, the writer who wrote the book Mailer, His Life and Times, and caused a big break in the relationship between Mailer and Peter Mantha. Leo Mantha was a very kind of spiritual guy. I met him when I interviewed him actually twice, one in 1987 and a couple of years later. He died in 1993. He was very much part of the Provincetown art scene. He had a school there for many years, and he was part of the Long Point Gallery, which was for about 20 years, the most prestigious gallery in Provincetown. It closed in the late 90s. So he summered in Provincetown, and I went to meet him in his house, and we walked through a little garden, and there was a little, almost like a shed, but that was his studio, and that's where he worked. And let me just show you some, he was it was a wonderful collages. And he had this collection of stuff, quilts and old maps and shingles and fragments of slate that he used to create these really wonderful collages. He was a master collagist. His work was, so this work here, this is the only one in the collection. This one, and you'll see that upstairs, pretty big painting. Was early, and that was when he was interested in Impressionism, and he said, you know, but he went beyond that. He said, you know, if you don't know much, you can't do much, and that was what he was saying, which is very abstract and really very interesting, and it does feel very spiritual to me. He was, and I'm going to read you some of his words because he was pretty interesting. When we looked at some of his in his studio, some of these pieces of paper and interesting things, he said his idea, his response is what he's going to do comes out of the material. And he pointed out the curve of a shingle or a spot of paint on a piece of wood, and that would apparently inspire or spark him to do something. He was intellectual. Conversation was often because I'm not that into Eastern philosophy, and he was very well schooled in that, and so we he would talk about things that, you know, were a little above my head, and then he would make this quick switch and talk about his wife of 52 years and his 2 sons. And the fact that he was a good cook and he had 28 recipes for pasta sauce. So we would go from this esoteric discussion of art, which was a little bit over my head, to 28 recipes for pasta sauce. But that early piece here, he said was influenced by Turner and Monet. You could see the light. It's abstract, and that's when he said, but if you haven't lived much, you can't say much. He was looking for something more permanent than this fleeting sensation of light, and then he said, I am trying to achieve some linkage with major myths which run through mankind's experience. He said, if this sounds pretentious, I apologize. But that's the only way I know how to say it. I'd rather be a poet than a reporter. And of course, here I am. But what he meant was his work was going to be poetry. It wasn't going to be a reporter reporting on the world around him in a very realistic way. That wasn't his interest. He had traveled a lot to the east, to Nepal, to Tunisia, and he said color was important, and it certainly was when we look at, not so much that one, but when we look at that one, he said color was important. He said, but the function of color is structural and psychological. When we think about that, the color is, you know, forms a structure, but color is also psychological. We respond to color in emotionally. So, you know, that was the point he was making. So he said, so much of art is about the emotional and psychological. To find the form for the feeling and proportion of elements and their relationship is you know, that's what he was trying to do. And then he said, I am trying to express a state of mind. And he said Eastern art, I says Eastern art and philosophy was a major influence. He said, and he said the West tends to dominate, and the East, you go with the flow. And that's probably true. I mean, I assume it is, yeah. But he said, he was funny because he said that he couldn't escape his Western connections. And he said he was organized and he worried about the future. And he couldn't break away from the pressures of daily life. But art, he said, was an escape hatch. Motherwell, who we're going to get to shortly, said, called Mantha one of collage's masters. Seductively beautiful, this is what Motherwell said, seductively beautiful as the work is at first sight, it holds its own like iron, a visual poetry that never compromises, never loses its inner life. And that's Motherwell speaking, and I have a lot of wonderful quotes from Motherwell that we're going to get to shortly. But when you think, and by the way, all of these quotes that I'm going to read to you in a few minutes that Motherwell said, he didn't write them. This wasn't an email interview. This was an interview where he spoke and I taped it. And he spoke like some people write. He was extremely articulate, and you could see where some people thought he was a better writer about art than he was a painter, a visual artist, but that's an old thing. So, okay, so just a little bit more about Mantha. He said he had no preconceived ideas when he started working on art. And here's a quote. "It's like setting sail without a destination and building the ship as you go." He said the ship must meet both an aesthetic and psychological standard. If it's just aesthetics, then the picture is a design, a decoration. If it's just a psychological connection, then it's a tantrum, a catharsis. For me, it has to be both. And I think when people talk about abstract expressionism, they think of it as a tantrum, a catharsis, an expression, a very personal expression. When we talked about Torkov last week, we talked about how he just gave that up and wanted to work on the grid and have it very defined and clear and not emotional, but you know, intellectual. So it's you know, I think that's really pretty interesting how he felt. Then he was 75 when I interviewed him. He said, "I've reached an age when I don't give a damn what anyone thinks. I want to make a mystery. I want to make something that's inexplicable. All art's a matter of spirit. No words can explain it. It just is." He died in 1993, and the New York Times wrote that he was an important force in the development of Provincetown as one of America's leading art colonists. That was a quote from the New York Times. So, an interesting here's another Mantha. Here's Lillian Orlowski, who married to William Fried, we talked about earlier. She studied with Hoffman. She started out, you know, she went from representational work to abstract expressionism. And you can see these pieces that these are all in our collection. Certainly with this work, you see the influence of Hoffman. She moved to Provincetown in 1942 with her husband, and for a while in the 40s and the 50s, where the Fine Arts Work Center is now. It's the old Days Lumberyard, and there were studios there. And Motherwell had a studio there, Helen Frankenthaler. But prior to that, in the 40s and 50s, Hoffman had a studio there, and Lillian Orlowski and William Freed. And she said they shared the bathroom, she said, and there were only ice boxes and a 2-burner Kerosene stove, and she said she was queen of the casserole. The only woman, obviously, there. I guess she had to do the cooking. I did interview her too when she was pretty old. She was a kind of a grandmotherly, this is Sam Feinstein, early work. Kind of a grandmotherly lady, very, you know, like a grandmother. You wouldn't think she was this kind of, look at this work. You wouldn't think of that coming from her. I mean, she really did remind me of somebody's grandmother. Anyway, this is early Sam Feinstein. And we have several of these pieces are all from the collection. The one you've most often seen here is this one, which was when he became, when he went into abstraction. These were early works he did in Gloucester, certainly influenced by Cubism, and he studied with Hoffman and taught like Hoffman. I got to know Sam a little bit. I don't know that I actually interviewed him. I think I might have once, but anyway, I sat in on a couple of his classes. He had a summer home in Dennis. He taught in New York and Philadelphia, at Princeton, privately. And he also taught here on the Cape. And I sat in on one of his classes, and he, in a barn right here in Dennis, and he had set up a still life, if you wanted to call it that, which was about the length of this wall here, with draped fabrics and old jugs and dried flowers and all kinds of things, which he said is what Hoffman did. And he had his students find some area that they were interested in to paint. And they could paint it realistically, they could paint it any way they wanted. And he would walk around the class and not talk about art, he would talk about a book he read or some philosophy, and his students would paint. He also did a film on Hoffman, because he got very friendly with Hoffman. He had studied with him, and then and actually the film previewed at the Metropolitan Museum. This was his early work, and certainly representational, but modernist. You know, certainly has a Cubist kind of influence, shows us, you know, Cubist, and then he goes into something like that, which is fiery, and clearly the color is from Hoffman. Very, very fascinated with color and kind of texture and throwing this paint. He exhibited in New York and Provincetown for from the 30s through the 50s, and then he made a decision not to exhibit at all. He didn't sell his paintings. He had no galleries. He never could quite figure out why. Now his wife, Pat, or his widow, has had a number of exhibits, or a few exhibits around exhibiting his work, and I think she's trying to, you know, hopefully make it better known. He's an interesting artist. We only have two small pieces by Robert Motherwell, and they're minor, so I'm going to show you some of his most important work. I interviewed him. I came to the Cape in 1979, and I was here earlier, but I started working at the Cape Cod Times in 1979 in the winter. And that summer, and I didn't know anything about the Provincetown Art Colony. I never even knew there was an art colony there. I knew Provincetown, and it was pretty crazy, and I think I saw it in a very superficial way. But found out that he was going to have an exhibit at Long Point Gallery, which was the cooperative gallery in Provincetown that ran from the late 70s through the late 90s, and it had the most important artists of the time exhibiting there. So I called and many of you have heard this story before, but it's kind of a funny story. Anyway, I called when I found out it was Robert Motherwell, I was really impressed. I thought, I wonder if I can get an interview with him. So I called the director of the gallery and said I wanted to interview Robert Motherwell, and she said, well, let me check. And she called me back, I don't know, a few days later and said, okay, you're all set, which I was stunned by. So anyway, Motherwell lived right on Commercial Street. As you come into town, it's not their house anymore, it's been sold. So the 3-story gray shingled house with a balcony and right on the water, obviously. So I could never quite figure out why I got this interview, because it seemed, he was a big deal. So, and this was just the Cape Cod Times. I'm not putting down the Cape Cod Times, but it was just a small paper. Anyway, I have a feeling, and I have no idea that his director, the director of the gallery, called and said, well, the Times wants to interview you. And I think he might have thought I was the New York Times. Anyway, I got there, he was on the phone, he was very controlled, very cool, kind of an elitist, I think. He didn't warm up very easily. He wasn't like Chaim Gross, or even Will Barnett over the phone. He was very reserved. Anyway, he was on the phone. He finally got off the phone. We started talking. I had my tape recorder. He didn't have a problem with that. And so I'm going to read you a lot of what he had to say, because I think it will not only provide insight on his work, but also on abstract expressionism and art in general. So anyway, the story ran in the Cape Cod Times, so he then knew that it wasn't the New York Times. And the Boston Magazine called me and said they had been trying to get an interview with Motherwell and couldn't. So
It was a secret.
what did I do? I said, I don't know. So they said, could you interview him for us? At that point, he was back in Greenwich. So I called, and he said yes. But then it was Boston Magazine, so it was a whole other thing. Anyway, so I spent the day with him in Greenwich, and it was before GPS, but I drove there, and we had friends in Stamford, so I stayed with them. Found his place, and it was in this big, Greenwich, Connecticut. I drove up, and there was this long driveway, and I figured there's this mansion, that's where he lives, but no. He lived in a converted carriage house where there were 4 studios, and he was on the 2nd floor. That's where he lived. And I spent the day with him, most of the time in a studio that was probably as the length of this room, maybe not as wide, where he had 5 of his elegies propped against the wall. His elegies run 10, 12 feet. Okay. Big, like that. And we sat and we talked. We had lunch with his, there were several, he had another studio for his collages, another studio for his prints, another studio for his framing. And he had a Princeton student there who was doing his thesis, and they brought lunch in and we had lunch. Anyway, the Provincetown place was a typical summer cottage, nothing special. When I went upstairs, he took me upstairs to where he lived in Greenwich, and there were, it was a nicely, not fabulous, but a nicely appointed room, but there were paintings by Miro and Franz Klein and Matisse, so, and of course him. So, he was, when I interviewed him, he had in the 70s, he had exhibitions in all over the world, in Mexico, in Germany, in Sweden, in Vienna, in Paris, in London, in Scotland, and in Long Point. So he was, pretty, he was a powerhouse at his time. I think actually, looking at his auction prices today, he's not kept up with people like Pollock and de Kooning, or even Mark Rothko. It's kind of interesting. But in his time, he was like one of the dominant figure in the abstract expressionist movement. He was born in Washington State in 1915. He studied very briefly at the California Institute of Art, and mostly he didn't study studio art. He got a philosophy degree from Stanford, and then went to New York and got an advanced degree at Columbia, and that's where he met Meyer Shapiro, who was teaching at Columbia, an art historian, who introduced him in the 40s to a lot of the European artists who had come to the United States to escape World War II in Paris. So he met, through Meyer Shapiro, he met a lot of the surrealists, and some of that was what sparked abstract expressionism. He first came to Provincetown in 1942 with Peggy Guggenheim, who was then married to Max Ernst. And Peggy Guggenheim later in the early 40s gave Motherwell a show. He said he would never go back to California. He arrived in Provincetown, and it reminded him, the light reminded him a lot of the where he had summered on a peninsula in Washington, the light, right on the water. And he said, but he would never go back to the west, to California. He said, because the climate is mild and it leads to an outdoor life and discourages intellectual pursuits. And he said, you begin to forget who Spinoza was. So that's where he was coming from. He also, along with Peggy Guggenheim and Max Ernst, he had a Mexican actress, Maria, who had apparently sacrificed a screen test for the role of Maria in Ernest Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls, in order to accompany Motherwell to Provincetown. And they were married in Provincetown. Most of the early 50s, he summered in East Hampton, which was where Pollock was and where de Kooning was. But then he left, he said, because of all its high pressure and status consciousness. And he really liked Provincetown. He felt it was egalitarian. He really loved the ease of it, the fact that people didn't kind of pay him very much attention. He was just one of the many artists in town. He said in East Hampton, people looked at him as if he were a stock on the exchange. So, and East Hampton was a significant art colony around the same time. He, when I interviewed him in Provincetown, it was a real hot, humid day, and we ended up sitting outside on the deck, and there was the water, and he started talking about what it was like living there, and I'm going to read you some things that he said about living and the views he could see, not just the water, but he said all painters are voyeurs. Nearly all painters love street life. I think the reason Paris has been so important in the history of art is because of its cafe life. You see, I lived in Paris for 1.5 years, and in France, nobody ever invites you to their home, no matter how well you know them. I mean, if you're invited to a person's house, it means you're symbolically become a relative. And that might happen after 10 or 20 years. Different groups of people, in this case artists, had favorite cafes. And we all know some of those cafes. Anyway, anytime you feel like seeing somebody, you know he's apt to be at such and such a cafe in the late afternoon or late at night, before lunch or whatever his habits are. And you can go and see him there and stay as long as you want, and also leave when you want. And also watch the passing scene. All of which fits a creative psychology much better than to have to be at somebody's house at 7:30 and stay until 11:30, whether you actually feel like painting or are bored, or conversely, you're having such a good time that you get drunk and lose the next day's painting. He went on to say, painters live off the eye. One of the things I like right here is the tidal flat. At low tide, it goes out 900 feet and people are walking all the time. So I have my own cafe right in the water. There's no other place in the world, or in America that I know of, where such a marvelous thing for a painter exists. He loved Provincetown. He was there from like 1953 till he died there in 1991. Summers, and between there and New York, and then Greenwich, where he settled. He didn't get involved in that center of town where there was so much, kind of frantic activity. He would walk from his house to the Art Association, stayed in that quiet east end of town, and he said people didn't pay him much attention. He was just one of those artists. He said, and this is kind of interesting, he said, but tourists were not so accommodating, and this is a story he told. He said, when people cross the line into Provincetown, psychologically many feel all the normal rules of decency are suspended. And he was describing how people knocked on his door, blatantly ignoring the by appointment only sign. And he said, they say, are you the artist? And I say, yes. And they ask, do you sell from the studio? And I say, no. And then they stand there expecting me to ask them in for a drink, which I'm sure he didn't do. I got in, but I didn't get a drink. He loved Provincetown. He called it his neighborhood. And it was the place in the 40s and the 50s where all of that first wave of abstract expressionists, Rothko, Pollock, Rothko had a house there, Klein was there, Gottlieb was there, even Jackson Pollock was there briefly, and de Kooning was there. So they were all there, and which was one of the reasons why Provincetown began to continue to flourish as an art colony, because and Motherwell stayed the longest. So he it was pretty easy for him to move into abstract art because he had very little art training. If we think of Picasso, and we saw what Picasso did when he was 12 and 13, he could paint like Rembrandt, but I don't think Motherwell really didn't do any representational work. He was very influenced by the surrealist artists that came to New York that he met through Meyer Shapiro. And he said he talked about psychic automatism, which was part of surrealism, and he said it's basically what it is doodling. And it's doodling from your unconscious. I tend to be a doodler, and anybody that's seen me at a meeting knows I am. And I read somewhere, people say, well, you're not paying attention, but I read somewhere that people that doodle actually absorb more that's going on in the meeting than people who don't doodle. That's somebody, I read that. Anyway, I doodle, but I don't think about it. I'm really listening to the meeting and you know, and getting involved, but I can't stop just doing something. And so that's unconscious, and this is what he is saying is the root of abstract expressionism, this unconscious doodling. And he said, you know, he said it's the way children start. Little children who are the best painters outside the great painters. And then we send the kid to school and tell him to color in the lines. And then some kid says, what does that mean? And he loses all his confidence. And, you know, I remember with my kids, I never wanted to give them coloring books. Just give them paper and let them, you know, color. Anyway, so a lot of it was, he talked about automatism, which was, and when we think about abstract expressionism, it is related to that. It's that big gesture, that unconscious movement. There are three different series of works that Motherwell is known for. We have two examples that are essentially prints in the collection. One is his elegy to the Spanish Republic. And he did dozens and dozens of them. They're very, very large. He, some people thought it was just architectural shapes. Other people saw it as phalluses. And other people just saw the black and the Spanish as relating to kind of a memorial for the losses during the Spanish Civil War, or related to the battle in bullfighting, or to death. Motherwell loved black, and there was a lot of black in his work, and he felt, so a lot of people don't feel black as that, you know, black is not a color, but to him it was a color, a really important color. What he did say about abstract expressionists was that a lot of people really wondered if it wasn't done by monkeys, or if it was some kind of joke on the public. And here's another interesting thing about it. He said a lot of the fact that the abstract expressionists made such an important statement on American art was because of the war. And Peggy Guggenheim had this, in the 40s, had Art of this Century Gallery, and she was very involved in modern art and showed Pollock and de Kooning and Motherwell. She showed a lot of these artists. Anyway, Motherwell said if Peggy Guggenheim had been able to get European artists during the period, meaning the World War II period, she would have been much less interested in us Americans. With European artists in New York, of course, that helped kind of spark European artists, and certainly Hoffman tended to spark the eruption of abstract expressionism, which liked to think of itself as strictly American, which I think it is, but it really was related to what had happened what had previously happened in Europe. And certainly it was influenced by the European artists who were here, certainly Hoffman, thousands. Motherwell didn't study with Hoffman, but certainly thousands of artists did. So the elegy is these are three series. No, I have to go back. These two are in the collection, and we don't have. Oh, I'm sorry. We had. I thought I had. It had an open. This isn't. There were two others. This is an example of his collages. which were very connected to Matisse. He saw Matisse's when he was in California, and this is what he said. He said, and when he saw them, they went through me as though I had been hit by an archer. When we think about Matisse and the color, that's how powerful. And his, this is a collage, his open series. I thought I had an image, but I don't. They were basically color, kind of a block of color, and then this shape like this, like an open door or an open window. It somehow got lost in the. But anyway, that and so the elegies, his open series, and he did a lot of them, and the collages are his three most in important areas of work. And when we talked about black, also he when we think about black, we think of it as being very spontaneous. I mean, you can see the drips here. You see again the hand of the artist. He said, and the other color he loved was blue. He said, all summer long, I see blue and white in sand color more than anything else. And so I begin to use those colors a lot. It's like osmosis. The colors fill me. I become obsessed with them in the same way I do with the dark earth colors in winter. And the blue, we don't have an example, but it's a real kind of rich, cerulean blue. And he says it is in New York they call it Motherwell blue. And it's in a lot of his work. A few more, I won't have time to go upstairs, so. Okay, I'm gonna read you a couple more quotes and then we're gonna go up, okay? A few minutes. I just want to finish him. He talked about music, and he said music, I think I mentioned this before, music is abstract. It doesn't have to duplicate reality, whereas we expect a painting or a piece of visual art to duplicate reality. He said, it should have its own internal logic. The main, and then he went on, the main function of the artist in a way is ethical, he said. He is not beholden to anyone else. He says, he paints, he composes exactly what he thinks. He has total integrity. Almost everyone else is caught up in a web of endless compromises. The artist is someone who doesn't have to compromise. And he said he refused to conform to an art that might be easier to understand. And this is an interesting quote. You don't give a false mathematical equation because it's easier to understand, if it's not true. The Einsteinian equation to many people is very difficult, but it would never have occurred to Einstein to put it in a way that people could understand, which would then be false. The truth about that particular aspect of reality requires a very complicated, difficult formula. And in that sense, any true artist is putting down the most accurate formula he can for what he perceives. And if people don't get it, that's so much the worse for them, and so much worse for him if he wants to be popular. The truth is the truth, and you don't want to change it to make it more palatable, to reach more people. I really don't care if my audience is 500 or 5,000, which I imagine it is, or 5 million or 50 million. What you basically do is what you think is right in a work and assume that there are a certain number of people who have sufficient experience and discrimination to dig it. I love when you use that word. I'm perfectly aware most people don't. In any aesthetic experience, the artist contributes what he has, but is equally dependent on what the observer brings to it. So he recognized that. All right, I want to try to finish this anyway, because there's so much really good stuff here. The ultimate object of art, he said, is not ecstatic or transcendental. Ecstasy is not just joy. I'm sorry, I read that wrong. The ultimate object of art is an ecstatic or transcendental experience. Ecstasy is not just joy. It's much more complicated than that. I would say art, all the arts, is the only means we have to express ecstasy in all its dimensions. There's nothing that a person in daily life has, including multiple orgasms, that really approaches the many-layered ecstasy of a great work of art. And actually, what distinguishes human beings from everything else in the universe is the capacity for experiencing ecstasy. I think making love is most people's form of ecstasy, and art is another form of ecstasy, and all the same rules apply. For some people, drugs are a form of ecstasy. For other people, power is. Which, when we think of what's going on politically, that kind of resonates, doesn't it? He went on to say that, you know, his work was selling very well, and he's, but in the 40s, he said, what he said was, when abstract expressionism was coming into its own, they weren't very market savvy. And he said they would just be happy if a dealer would show their work. It was the pop artists that came in the 60s that really taught them about marketing and how to do it. And, you know, he said, and then he went on to say, money wasn't the object. It doesn't make me one bit happier, except in one regard, being an older man, and he was 64 at the time. It's marvelous to have money as one becomes physically more helpless. Unfortunately, in America, the reality of things somehow has to be confirmed by money. Most artists are affected by that. I'm enormously paid for what I do, and I suppose part of my unconscious thinks it must be very real. The work I do must be very good, or people wouldn't pay for it. On the other hand, I can think of various artists who are very highly paid, but I think very little of their work, and think they are self-deluded because they are making a lot of money. So it can be a trap, blinding oneself to the real truth. And then, I think this might have been the last thing he said when we were in Greenwich, might have been the last quote in the story. He said, I started in a hostile painting environment in which only a handful of people cared about what I did. If it reverts to that handful, that won't change my feelings about it. The older I get, the more I become aware that all reality is in flux. I'm an old man mad about painting, and no matter what the world thinks, I will remain mad about painting, which is how I began and how I'll end. And his end came in 1991. He died in Provincetown. He had a stroke. And actually he died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, and he was 76 years old. Clement Greenberg, one of the big art critics that promoted abstract expressionists, said he was the very best of the abstract expressionist painters. I was there to cover the memorial service, which wasn't like Haim's at the Provincetown Museum, but on the beach, right outside his house. The deck had his widow, Renata, and his two daughters, and some speakers, and down on the beach there were, you know, children playing in the sand, and there were a large number of people. Norman Mailer was there, Joel Meyerowitz was there shooting pictures, and there were people talking. Sculptor Jack Kearney said that when the rescue squad arrived, Motherwell asked to sit up, and Kearney said Motherwell took a long look at this special spot, the beach and the bay he loved so much, before they took him to the hospital. So that was probably the last thing he saw, was his really beloved Provincetown. Stanley Kunitz, poet, very prominent in the art colony, called Motherwell one of the emblematic figures of our generation. Another friend remembered his passion, sensuality, and earthiness, and how he loved fried clams and Louisa. And art historian Jack Flam said, long after he is gone, his pictures will continue to speak to people who never spoke to him. So, I know I read that quickly, but I just think it was so important for us to kind of get a perspective from probably one of the most brilliant artists that I've ever spoken to. He spoke just as I'm reading these words, without a hesitation, without a pause. He was truly brilliant.
What year was that interview?
Well, when did I first?
Yeah,
79, and then again the fall was the summer of 79, and then it was the spring of 1980 in Greenwich. And he died in 1991. And I would see him. I didn't have, unlike what I would go to see Chaim Gross in New York, and had developed a relationship with both him and his wife. And in fact, after the memorial service at Pam, they had a dinner for people who were, you know, a group of people, and I was invited to the dinner. So that was different. I didn't have that kind of relationship with Motherwell. It was just purely professional. I would see him at Long Point at openings, and you know, but that was it. We didn't really talk, and he was very busy. At Long Point, the openings were very, very busy. It was it's where a WOMR is now, on the second floor, above like schoolhouse. It was always hot, and there were a ton of people, and everybody was congregated around Motherwell because he was like the kingpin of that group. They were all very important artists. Most of them we're going to talk about. And actually most of them I interviewed at one time or another. But there was always people around him. Everyone would kind of, he was this great man, and he was in Provincetown, and everybody wanted to get near him and touch him. So it wasn't like I didn't have. The next time I actually reported about him was when after he had died. And I know I wrote I remember the story ran on the front page of the paper, and then I wrote a long appreciation because I had so much wonderful material from him after 2 very long interviews with him. But I never had that kind of, never developed he was kind of in his own world, I guess, whatever. I didn't get to know him that well. I interviewed both of his daughters because he had a show, it was called Beyond This, something about the sea, at Pam a couple of years ago, and I interviewed both of his daughters. And I remember they both seemed a lot like him. Pretty, Lise Motherwell. There's Lise and Jeannie, and Lisa's, I think, on the board of the Pam. But they were both pretty removed, very reserved when I interviewed them. They were, kind of like their father, I suppose. Motherwell was married to Helen Frankenthaler at one point. Helen Frankenthaler died, I don't know, a couple of years ago, and I remember reading about them going to the funeral. I guess they weren't her children. They were previous, he must have been married maybe 4 times. Must have been married. He was married to that Maria, and then there was somebody else who I think was the mother of the 2 girls, and then he was married to Helen Frankenthaler, and then he was married to Renata Hansold, who was his widow, so he was probably married 4 times. But apparently the daughters were very close to Helen Frankenthaler, who was not in the collection, whom I did interview about, but she's not in the collection, so we won't talk about her. I don't know if we have time to go upstairs. Do we want to? It's up to you. Does everybody need to? I know I have a meeting too.
Yeah.
So what we'll do is try to look at them again, or anybody that wants to go up, I'll go up with them.
Next week.
And if you, does anyone want to?
2 weeks. And 2 weeks.
When is the class that's the odd time?
Oh, not until,
2 weeks.
20th.
no, the 20th. Yeah. Oh, and I should also mention, if people are interested, someone asked me to mention it, the Arts Foundation of Cape Cod, on November 1st is having this creative exchange, which is, I think, a day of events and panels, and a lot of networking goes on. I don't know, you can go on to the Arts Foundation, and I'm actually going to be on one of the panels, but if it interests you, you can go onto the website and find out.
And something else at the end.
That's there's a fee for that conference, but at 5:30, I think.
Oh, right, that's when Mindy Todd.
5:30 and 7 p.m. There's a free event hosted by Mindy Todd of WCAI, listen to that radio station.
So I'm,
And she'll be interviewing the candidates for state office on the subject of the arts.
Oh.
So if you're an art supporter, you might want to hear an art.
yeah, and that's the free event. There is a
Yeah,
charge
that
for
part's
the
free.
other, but the other one is a whole day thing. I think it includes lunch and stuff, so, anyway. So does anyone want to go upstairs, or everybody's tired?
I would like to.
Yeah, no, I know. I could go for a few
Would
minutes.
we have time, the next class, to spend some time with some of the artists you mentioned today?
Yeah, you know what
I'd
we'll
like to
do?
do that.
Yeah, okay, why don't we do that? Well, next week, I'll really make sure we can go up and talk. I'll leave a half an hour to go up and talk about this art
Okay,
and
yeah,
what we're
next
doing
week,
next
yeah.
week. The problem is, I really do want to share these words with you, and you, tell me if do you think it's valuable?
Yeah.
It's fabulous.
Absolutely.
And that's why I'm trying to, kind of
Have
squeeze.
you written those quotes down anywhere, or?
Yeah, oh, a lot of them.
A lot of them, I haven't got that far in the book, I must look.
No, they're not in this. See,
I didn't
when I
think
did
so.
when I did this book was done, like a catalog. So I just did, typical bios on
Different
it.
format.
Yeah. A lot of those quotes, are in my Provincetown book. A lot of them. In fact, all of them are.
Okay.
That's where I
That
pulled
was
them
my
out of,
question.
yeah.
They are great quotes.
Yeah, they're wonderful. So they're all there.
They're all there.
When I did the art colony book, they're all there. Yeah, no, I didn't.
You didn't miss those.
No.
Thank you.
Yeah, because I interviewed her. See, I only, in this book is only the ones that are in our collection, so. But there are a lot. I mean, there are a ton of artists that as we go on, you know, I'm looking at section, I have 5 artists that I interviewed. I'm gonna try to. Motherwell was the most, I spent the most time because his words were, I just thought, yeah,
I thought it was really interesting that his degree originally was in philosophy.
yeah,
That
and
he
aesthetics,
decided to-
yeah,
Whether it had anything to do with, because I've seen that series.
yeah, no, it is really very interesting that he was not, he never painted realism, so I don't know if he actually could.
Was he from a fairly controlled family? and
He was
Dad
from
didn't
a
appreciate-
Wells Fargo
There was a
banking.
banking family there. that didn't
Yes,
approve
and
of
so
his-
he didn't have the pressures of like Boris Margot, who could do these little cello cuts.
Yeah.
He had the financial support, yeah. And
And a
you could
different
see he
background.
came from that background. He was kind of elitist. When I compare him to somebody like Chaim Gross, who was just so, he was like a kind of a lovable teddy bear kind of thing. He was so warm, you could get to know him very easily, he was very open. Motherwell was just very, but brilliant, I mean, and I
Still
could,
got a lot from him.
what?
You still got a lot from him.
Oh, yeah. Yes, and that, a lot of that is really, you gotta come, when I always tell the young reporters, you're doing something, interviewing somebody like Robert Motherwell or, some other famous person, you really need to do your homework, and you don't go in and say, where were you born? They only ask you know, you really go, you've done your homework, and you start asking serious questions that really probe. And that's how you get good interviews. But if you know, if someone would go down a woods hole to interview a scientist, they need to know what they're talking about, or, you know, they need to be really schooled. I'm not sure I would have wanted to do that because I didn't have that much knowledge. But it didn't matter, even though I had a lot of background in art. I really did a lot of homework, prepared myself for any of those interviews. But everybody's different. I mean, you know, compare even Will Barnett over the phone at age 100. He was very easy to talk to, very, very different. And I, you know, had spent a whole day with Motherwell in Greenwich. I mean, I was there all day, through lunch till late in the afternoon, and you would think I would have, but no.
Well, you were invited back, that was the second interview?
Yeah, that
He
was-
obviously respected you.
That's right.
or-
Yeah, right.